The sun burned the land until even the stones looked tired. The air was dry and hot enough to hurt the lungs. Nothing moved except a few swirling dust devils across the endless plain. A young woman named Clara walked alone on that trail, her steps slow and uneven, her boots torn at the edges. Her once white dress had turned the color of sand. Sweat had dried long ago, leaving salt lines on her skin. Her lips were cracked, her tongue heavy. She had been walking since sunrise, but the desert had no mercy. For days, she had followed the faint wagon tracks toward the next town. She had left her old life behind, her small cabin, the broken well, and the graves of her parents who had died when the drought came. Everything she once loved had turned to dust, just like the ground beneath her feet. She had sold her last horse for food and water, but the water ran out 2 days ago. The food had turned to crumbs in her pocket. Still she walked. The sun climbed higher and her vision blurred. Her head pounded with every heartbeat. She stumbled and fell to her knees. The world around her shimmered like it was made of glass. Her canteen hung empty at her side, clinking softly as she crawled forward. "Just one drop," she whispered, her voice too dry to be heard. "Just one drop of water." The desert gave no answer, only silence. When she lifted her eyes, she thought she saw movement at the far edge of the horizon, a dark shape against the golden light. Her heart jumped, but she quickly looked away, thinking it was another cruel trick of the heat. But the shadow grew larger, steadier. It moved like a man on horseback. She blinked again. The shape didn't disappear this time. A rider was coming her way, her weak heart filled with both fear and hope. Bandits roamed these lands. She knew that. But so did good men. Men who carried water. The sound of hooves grew closer. The rider slowed when he saw her. Dust rose around him as he stopped a few feet away. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with sunburned skin and calm gray eyes. His hat shaded most of his face, but she could tell he was younger than she expected, maybe in his early 30s. His horse, a chestnut mare, snorted softly, lowering its head toward her as if it understood her pain. The man dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He walked to her side and crouched down. "Miss," he said in a quiet voice, "you look like you're fighting the whole desert." Clara tried to speak, but no sound came out. She opened her mouth, pointed at the empty canteen on her belt, and managed to whisper, "Water, please." He didn't hesitate. He reached for the canteen tied to his saddle and brought it to her hands. It was made of worn leather, cool to the touch. Her fingers trembled so much that he steadied them with his own rough hands. "Slowly," he said softly. "Don't drink too fast." The first drops touched her tongue, and it was like tasting life again. She drank greedily, the cool water running down her throat, easing the fire that had been burning for days. Tears welled in her eyes as she drank, but the cowboy gently took the canteen back after a few gulps. "That's enough for now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Too much all at once will make you sick." Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her whole body shaking. Why would you share?" she asked, her words barely a whisper. "You might need it." He looked at her for a moment, then gave a faint smile. "Ain't no man worth calling human who'd let someone die of thirst while he's still got a drop left." She stared at him, too weak to answer. His eyes held no pride, only calm kindness. The wind picked up, carrying a bit of sand across his coat, but he didn't move. He looked like a man used to hardship, someone who had faced more than one kind of storm. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried to push herself up, but her legs trembled too much. He caught her before she fell. "Easy now," he said, his voice steady. "No shame in letting someone help." He helped her to her feet, supporting her with one arm. She felt light as straw. Her body leaned against his as if she had no will left of her own. The horse snorted again, watching quietly as he led her closer. "My ranch is a few miles west," he said as he lifted her gently onto the saddle. "You'll rest there. There's shade, food, and more water than you can finish." She could barely focus, her vision dimming. "Why are you helping me?" she murmured. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because I've seen what this desert does to folks. Once watched my brother die out here when we were boys. Promised myself never again if I could stop it." Clara felt her throat tighten, not from thirst but from the weight of his words. She tried to thank him, but her voice broke. "Thank you," was all she could say. He adjusted her in the saddle, mounted behind her, and clicked the reins. The horse began to move, steady and calm. The world around them seemed to melt under the sun. but the steady rhythm of hooves gave her comfort. Every step took them closer to life. After a while, she leaned back against him without meaning to. She felt the beat of his heart, steady and strong like the pulse of the land itself. He didn't move away or speak. He simply rode on, letting her rest. As the hours passed, the sun sank lower, turning the desert gold and orange. In the distance, she could see dark shapes, trees maybe, or rocks. The promise of shade. Her heart lifted a little. "What's your name?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Call me Luke," he said. "Luke Turner," she nodded weakly. "Clara," she replied. He gave a quiet chuckle. "Clara suits you. Strong name. A bit too strong for this desert." She managed a faint smile. For the first time in many days, she felt something other than fear or pain. She felt safe. As they rode into the evening, the sky turned soft with colors, pink, orange, and purple mixing over the horizon. The wind grew cooler. She could smell grass ahead, faint but real. When the first stars began to appear, Luke pointed ahead. "See that ridge?" he said. "My ranch sits right beyond it. Got a well that never runs dry by God's grace." Clara blinked through her tears. "You saved me," she whispered. "Just did what anyone should," he said simply. But in her heart, she knew not everyone would have done it. Most men out here would have ridden past. He hadn't. By the time they reached the ridge, Clara could barely keep her eyes open. The sound of crickets rose around them and the smell of hay drifted on the cool wind. She felt the world sway gently, then fade into darkness. Before she fell asleep, she whispered one last time, "Thank you, Luke." He looked down at her, his jaw tightening slightly. "Rest easy, Clara," he murmured. "You're safe now." As they rode under the stars, he kept his eyes on the horizon. He didn't know who she was or what had brought her across that deadly stretch of land. But something deep inside told him that this meeting wasn't by chance. The desert had taken much from him before, but tonight, it had given something back, something fragile, yet alive. And as the wind whispered across the plains, the cowboy rode on toward the quiet light of his distant ranch, carrying with him the woman who had almost lost her life chasing a single drop of water. Night had already fallen by the time Luke reached the ridge overlooking his ranch. The stars above shone like tiny fires scattered across the dark sky, and the moon hung low and pale over the land. His horse Daisy moved carefully down the slope, hooves soft against the dusty path. Clara lay slumped in front of him, half asleep, her head resting against his chest. She was breathing, faint but steady, and that was all that mattered to him. Luke's ranch sat in a small valley surrounded by dry hills. It wasn't much, just a weathered house, a barn, a few cattle pens, and a windmill that creaked whenever the wind blew. But it was quiet, safe, and his own. When he had bought the land 10 years ago, he had built everything with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail. It was a lonely life, but it was honest, and that had always been enough. As they reached the gate, Luke dismounted carefully and caught Clara before she could fall. Her body was light as air, like she hadn't eaten in days. He carried her inside the small cabin, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. He laid her down on the couch near the fireplace. The room smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Luke went to fetch water from the basin, then dipped a clean cloth and wiped the dust from her face. Her skin was pale beneath the dirt, her lips dry and cracked, but her breathing had steadied. He poured a little water into a cup and lifted her head. "Easy now," he whispered. "Just a sip." Clara's eyelids fluttered. She took a small drink, then sighed softly as if that simple act had brought her back from the edge of death. Luke straightened up and placed the cup beside her. Then he moved to the fire and added a few logs. The flames came to life, filling the room with gentle warmth. He watched her for a long time in silence, wondering who she really was. Women didn't travel alone through desert country unless they had a reason, a powerful one. After a while, he went to the kitchen and cooked a small pot of broth. It was nothing fancy, just water, dried vegetables, and a bit of salted meat. When it was ready, he poured a bowl and brought it to her side. The smell of food stirred her awake. "You should eat a little," he said. Clara blinked and looked around, her eyes adjusting to the light. For a moment she seemed confused, unsure where she was. "Where am I?" "Safe," he said simply. "My place." "You fainted out there." Her voice was faint but clear. "You brought me here?" He nodded. "Wouldn't leave you out there for the coyotes." She tried to smile, though her lips trembled. "I thought I was going to die." Luke handed her the bowl. "You won't, not while I'm here." She hesitated before taking the spoon, then began to eat slowly. Each bite seemed to bring color back to her face. She looked fragile, but there was strength in her eyes, a stubbornness that refused to give up. After a few moments, she looked up. "You could have kept writing," she said softly. "Most men would have," he shrugged. "Maybe, but I'm not most men." They sat in silence for a while. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft whistle of the wind outside. When she had eaten enough, she set the bowl aside and leaned back against the cushion. "Thank you, Mr. Turner," she said. "You saved my life." Luke shook his head. "Name's just Luke, and you don't owe me thanks." "Anyone would have done the same." She looked at him quietly, studying his face. "No," she said at last. "Not everyone would." He turned away, uncomfortable with the weight of her gaze. "Get some rest. There's a spare room upstairs if you can walk. You'll find a clean bed and some water to wash up." She nodded weakly. "I think I can manage." He helped her to her feet, steadying her as she climbed the short staircase. At the top, she turned to him. "Good night, Luke." "Night, Clara," he said softly. When she disappeared into the room, he stood for a long moment by the fire, staring into the flames. Something about her troubled him, something she wasn't saying. But it wasn't his place to ask. Not yet. He went outside and walked toward the barn. The night was cool now, and the air smelled faintly of sage. He brushed down his horse, gave her water, and looked out over the dark fields. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and he shook his head. "Another soul the desert almost took," he muttered. "But not tonight." Inside the cabin, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The bed was soft, the air cooler than it had been in days. But her mind wouldn't rest. She thought of the past, the fire that had burned her home, the men who had taken what little she had left, and the long road that had led her here. She had promised herself she would reach the next town, find work, start again. But if Luke hadn't come along, she would have been nothing but another lost traveler swallowed by the sand. The next morning, Luke rose before sunrise, as he always did. He brewed coffee, fed the animals, and checked the fences. When he came back inside, Clara was awake, sitting by the window wrapped in a blanket. The early light touched her hair, and for a moment she looked peaceful, almost like she belonged there. "Morning," he said. "How you feelin'?" "Better," she said with a small smile. "I don't think I've slept that well in years." He nodded toward the table. "Got some breakfast? Biscuits and eggs if you're up for it." She sat down and began to eat slowly, savoring every bite. Between bites, she looked up. "You live here alone?" "Mostly," he said. "Had a ranch hand once, but he moved east to start his own place. Now it's just me and Daisy. You don't get lonely." Luke gave a short laugh. "Used to it. The land's quiet, but it's honest. It don't lie to you." Clara smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's made peace with being alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe I did. Until yesterday." She looked down quickly, pretending to focus on her food. A blush touched her cheeks. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was gentle, the kind that made both of them feel oddly calm. After breakfast, she offered to help with chores. Luke tried to tell her to rest, but she insisted. "I can't just sit here while you work," she said. "I owe you too much already." So he let her feed the chickens and gather eggs while he repaired a section of fence. She moved slowly at first, her strength still returning, but she worked with quiet determination. Luke watched her from a distance. She was different from most women he'd met. Tough but graceful, like someone who had learned to survive more than once. By noon, the sun was high again, though not as cruel as before. They shared lunch under the shade of a tree behind the barn. Clara looked out over the open land, the dry hills stretching far into the distance. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Lonely, but beautiful," Luke nodded. "That's the desert for you. It takes almost everything, but what's left, it's pure." She looked at him, thoughtful. "You sound like you love it." He smiled a little. "Guess I do. Spent most of my life trying to tame it, but maybe it's tamed me instead." She laughed softly, the sound light and warm. It had been a long time since laughter had touched that ranch. As the day passed, a quiet bond began to grow between them. Luke didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer. But in small ways, through glances, gestures, and silences, they began to understand each other. Two people who had both lost too much, yet somehow found a reason to keep going. That evening, as the sky turned red and gold, Clara stood by the fence watching the horizon. Luke came to stand beside her. "You'll be all right here for as long as you need," he said. "No rush to leave." She turned to him, her eyes soft. "You don't even know who I am." He looked out at the land. "Don't need to. Sometimes it's enough to know who someone isn't. You're not cruel and you're not lost anymore. That's good enough for me." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the grass and the last light faded behind the hills. Clara's eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She had been saved by a stranger. Yet somehow she felt safer with him than she had in years. And deep down, Luke knew the desert hadn't just brought him someone to save. It had brought him someone who might just save him in return. The days passed quietly at Luke's ranch. The dry wind came and went, carrying the smell of sage and dust, and the nights were filled with the soft sound of crickets. Clara grew stronger with each sunrise. Her skin lost its pale color, and her voice no longer trembled when she spoke. She helped with chores, fed the animals, washed clothes, and even cooked simple meals when Luke was out tending the cattle. Luke tried to treat her like any guest, but something about her stayed in his mind. She worked hard and spoke little about herself, but her eyes sometimes carried a deep sadness, as if she was hiding memories too heavy to share. Still, he didn't ask. He knew that sometimes silence healed better than questions. One morning, Luke saddled his horse to check the far fences. The sun was already warm, turning the land gold. Clara stood by the porch holding a basket of laundry. "You sure you'll be fine alone?" he asked. She smiled softly. "I think I can handle a quiet house." He tipped his hat and rode off, his figure shrinking against the open land. As the dust settled, Clara let out a small sigh. The ranch felt peaceful, yet something in her chest remained restless. She hung the clothes one by one under the morning sun. The soft wind made them sway gently. For a while, everything seemed perfect. But then she heard something, a faint sound coming from the ridge. It was distant but sharp, like the clatter of hooves. Her heart tightened. No traveler usually came this way. Luke had said his ranch was far from the main trail. She stepped onto the porch and shaded her eyes. Far away, small dark shapes moved against the horizon. Horses, maybe 3, maybe 4. They were still distant but riding fast. Clara froze. The sound brought back memories she had tried to bury. Men shouting, fire burning, and a cruel laugh she could never forget. She hurried inside, shut the door, and pressed her back against it. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She forced herself to stay calm. Maybe they were just travelers, she told herself. Maybe ranchers passing through. But her heart whispered otherwise. An hour passed. The sound faded away, leaving only silence. She peeked through the window but saw nothing now. The desert looked empty again. Still, her hands trembled as she finished her chores. When Luke returned in the late afternoon, she was quiet. He noticed it right away. "Something wrong?" he asked, stepping down from his horse. She shook her head too quickly. "No, nothing." He frowned slightly. "You sure? You look like you saw a ghost." Her voice softened. "Maybe I just got scared of the wind." He studied her face, but she avoided his eyes. He didn't press further. "Well, if that wind starts talking, tell it I'm not in the mood," he said with a small grin. It made her smile faintly, and the moment passed. That evening, they sat together by the fire. Clara mended an old shirt while Luke cleaned his rifle. The quiet between them felt comfortable, the way quiet does between people who have learned to trust each other. "Luke," she said suddenly, her voice low, "do you believe people can start again? Even after everything?" He looked up from his work. "Reckon that's what living is all about," he said. "Starting again every time life knocks you down." She nodded slowly, eyes on the thread in her hands. "What if the past doesn't let you?" Luke leaned back, his gaze steady. "Then you ride faster than it does." She smiled faintly, but there was pain behind it. He could tell she wanted to say more, but couldn't yet. So he said nothing more either. The next few days were calm. Luke and Clara settled into a quiet rhythm, working, talking, and sharing small pieces of their lives. She told him she had once lived near a river town, that her father had been a school teacher and her mother a seamstress. She didn't mention what happened after. Luke, in turn, told her about his brother who had died in a sandstorm years ago, and how he had built the ranch to keep himself busy enough to forget the emptiness. They were 2 lonely souls who had found a strange peace in each other's company. Then, one afternoon, that peace broke. Luke was working near the barn, fixing a broken wagon wheel when Daisy began to snort and stomp. He looked up to see a cloud of dust rising in the distance. Horses again, 3 of them. He wiped his hands, picked up his rifle, and stood at the gate. As the riders drew closer, he saw their faces. Rough-looking men wearing worn hats and guns strapped to their sides. Their eyes were cold. "Afternoon," Luke said evenly as they stopped in front of the fence. The man in front, tall and thin with a black beard, tipped his hat slightly. "Afternoon to you too, friend. Fine place you got here." "Appreciate it," Luke said. "Can I help you with something?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're looking for someone. Woman. Passed through these parts not long ago. Might have been traveling alone." Luke's face stayed calm. "Can't say I've seen anyone." The man studied him carefully, as if weighing whether to believe him. "You sure?" She'd stand out. "Pretty thing, brown hair, green eyes. Stole something that belongs to us." Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "Sounds like trouble you brought on yourself." "I don't keep company with thieves." The man leaned closer against the saddle horn. "If you do see her, tell her the Redden brothers don't forget their debts. She'll wish the desert had finished her first." Luke's hand shifted near the rifle, but he kept his tone calm. "I'll remember that name. Now I'd suggest you keep riding. My land don't take kindly to strangers hanging around." The men stared at him for another moment, then turned their horses. "You have a nice day, cowboy," the leader said. They rode off toward the east, their laughter fading in the distance. Luke stood there until the dust settled, his heart heavy. He turned toward the house, and through the open window he saw Clara standing inside, her hands shaking. She had heard everything. He walked in slowly. "You want to tell me what that was about?" he asked quietly. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "They're the reason I was in the desert," she said, her voice trembling. "They came to my town months ago, claimed to be traders, but they were thieves. They took everything, money, food, even lives. I tried to stop them. I took a bag of coins they stole and ran." Luke listened without interrupting. "They burned everything," she whispered. "I thought if I could make it to the next town I could buy supplies, warn people. But I never got that far." He was silent for a moment, then said, "You did the right thing. You took what was stolen. They're the thieves, not you." Her voice broke. "They'll come back, Luke. They always do." He looked out the window toward the empty hills. "Let 'em. This land's seen worse than 3 outlaws." She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "You don't understand. They'll kill you if you protect me." Luke's eyes met hers, steady and calm. "I've buried worse men than them, Clara. You're safe here." For the first time since she met him, Clara saw the steel behind his kindness, the quiet courage of a man who didn't boast but never backed down. That night the air was thick with unease. Luke sat on the porch with his rifle resting across his lap, eyes scanning the dark horizon. Clara brought him a cup of coffee, her hand brushing his as she handed it over. "Thank you," he said. "You shouldn't be out here all night," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Sleep easy. If they come back, they won't get close enough to knock." She looked at him for a long time, her heart heavy with gratitude and fear. "You shouldn't risk your life for me." He gazed into the night. "Some lives are worth the risk." The silence that followed was deep, filled with things neither of them dared to say aloud. As the moon rose over the desert, the wind carried the faint echo of distant hooves again. Faint, but real. Luke's eyes narrowed. The Redden brothers hadn't gone far. He stood up slowly and loaded his rifle. "Looks like tomorrow might be a long day," he murmured. Inside the cabin, Clara watched him through the window, her heart pounding. She knew he meant every word, and for the first time in her life she prayed, not for herself, but for the cowboy who had given her water, shelter, and now perhaps his life. The desert was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. The night was too quiet. Even the crickets had stopped singing. Luke sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the dark ridge where the Redden brothers had disappeared earlier that day. The moonlight stretched over the land, soft and pale, turning the sand silver. His horse, Daisy, stood near the fence, ears twitching, restless. She sensed what he already knew. Trouble was close. Inside the cabin, Clara sat by the small window, her hands clasped tight. She could see his outline through the glass, steady and still like a statue carved out of strength. She wanted to tell him to come inside, to rest, but she knew he wouldn't. Luke Turner wasn't the kind of man who left things to chance. He would watch through the night, no matter how long it took. By morning, the horizon glowed pink and a new day began. Luke came inside, tired but calm. Clara was already awake, a pot of coffee on the stove. "You didn't sleep?" she asked softly, He shook his head. Didn't feel like missing anything. He sat down, poured himself a cup, and took a long sip. They'll come back. Men like that don't leave unfinished business. Clara's voice trembled. Then what do we do? We get ready, he said simply. You stay inside no matter what happens. Understand? She opened her mouth to argue, but saw the look in his eyes and nodded instead. All right. The rest of the morning passed quietly, though every sound made her flinch. The creak of the barn door, the wind through the dry grass, even the caw of a crow flying overhead. Luke worked in silence, checking his rifle, sharpening his knife, and laying out supplies. He didn't speak much, but there was a calmness about him that steadied her. By noon, the sky turned hot again. Luke saddled Daisy and rode out toward the ridge to see if the outlaws had set camp nearby. Clara watched him disappear over the hill, her heart tight with worry. Hours later, he returned. His face told her everything before he spoke. They're out there, he said. 3 of them. Camped about a mile north. They're waiting till dark. Clara felt her knees weaken. Luke, you can't face them alone, he gave a faint smile. Wasn't planning to let them in for tea either. She grabbed his arm, her voice breaking. Please, you don't have to do this for me. He looked at her gently. Clara, you came out of that desert half dead and you still had fight left in you. You did what was right, even when it cost you everything. I won't let men like that take from you again. Her eyes filled with tears, but he only gave her hand a small squeeze before walking outside again. As the sun began to set, the desert turned gold and red. Luke stood near the barn, checking his rifle one last time. He filled the water troughs, closed the chicken coop, and made sure the animals were locked safe. He moved through the tasks calmly, like a man preparing for something he had already accepted. Clara followed him silently. What if they burn everything like before? She whispered. Then we'll rebuild, he said without looking up. But this time they won't leave standing. When darkness finally came, the wind grew cold. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Clara sat inside near the lamp, clutching the cross around her neck, her heart pounding at every noise. Luke stood outside near the gate, the rifle in his hands, eyes fixed on the ridge. Then, far in the distance, came the sound he had been waiting for, the faint, steady beat of hooves. 3 riders. They came slow and sure, their shadows long in the moonlight. Luke waited until they were close enough to see their faces. The leader, the tall man with the black beard, grinned. Evening, Cowboy, he called. We figured we'd come back for what's ours. Luke's voice was calm, steady as the desert wind. Ain't nothing here belongs to you. The man laughed. That woman does. She's got something of ours and we'll be taking it. Luke raised the rifle slightly. You'll be taking a bullet if you try. For a moment, no one moved. The wind blew softly through the dry grass. Then the bearded man's smile vanished. You sure you want to die over a thief, stranger? Luke didn't answer. The next sound was the crack of his rifle. The leader's hat flew off and his horse reared back. The man shouted, ducking low. Gunfire erupted, the night filled with the thunder of shots and the smell of smoke. Luke moved fast, using the fence and barn for cover. His rifle fired again, then again. One of the outlaws fell from his horse, hitting the ground hard. The others split apart, circling. Inside, Clara crouched low by the window, her heart racing. She wanted to scream, to run out there, but she remembered his words. Stay inside. Still, she couldn't just hide. She crawled to the back door, opened the small chest near the wall, and pulled out an old revolver Luke kept there. Her hands shook as she checked the bullets. She had never fired a gun before, but she'd seen her father use one long ago. Outside, Luke's rifle clicked empty. He ducked behind the water trough and reloaded quickly. A bullet hit the wooden post inches from his head, splintering the wood. Persistent, he muttered under his breath. The leader's voice called out through the night. You're a good shot, Turner. But you can't hold out forever. Hand her over and we might let you live. Luke's voice was quiet but sharp. That ain't a bargain worth taking. The men fired again. Luke rolled behind the barn, firing back. He hit the second outlaw's shoulder and the man cried out, dropping his gun. The third one dismounted and tried sneaking along the fence, but Luke caught the movement. Meanwhile, Clara crept out the back door, moving low and quiet. She could see the flashes of gunfire lighting the dark. Her fear was strong, but something stronger pushed her forward. She wouldn't let Luke fight alone. She saw the wounded outlaw trying to raise his weapon again, aiming toward Luke's back. Without thinking, she lifted the revolver, aimed, and fired. The shot echoed across the valley. The man's hand jerked and his gun fell. Luke turned sharply, saw her standing there, and shouted, "Clara, get back inside." But she didn't move. Her hands shook, but her eyes were steady. "They'll kill you," she cried. The leader fired again, the bullet grazing Luke's arm. He staggered, dropped behind the trough, and winced. Clara ran to him, grabbing his other arm. "You're hit," she gasped. "Just a scratch," he said, though the blood told otherwise. "Stay low." The leader reloaded and began walking closer, his boots crunching on the dirt. "You think you can hide behind that girl? I'll take her myself when I'm done with you." Luke's eyes went cold. He stood up slowly, his rifle steady. "You talk too much," he fired once more. The leader dropped where he stood, his gun slipping from his hand. The desert went silent again. The echo of the shot faded into the hills. Clara's breath came fast. She stared at the lifeless men, then at Luke, whose arm was bleeding but whose eyes stayed calm. "It's over," she whispered. Luke nodded, his shoulders lowering. For now, he sat down heavily by the trough, pressing his hand to his arm. Clara tore a piece of her dress and wrapped it around the wound, her fingers trembling. "You saved my life," she said softly. He looked at her with tired eyes. "Guess we're even now." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "No, Luke. I'll never be even with you." They sat there together in the cool night air, the stars bright above them, the danger finally gone. The desert wind blew gently, carrying away the dust of the fight. When the first light of dawn broke, Luke buried the outlaws on the far side of the ridge. Clara stood beside him, silent and pale, her hands folded. "I never wanted this," she said quietly. "I just wanted to be free." He covered the last grave with sand and looked up at her. "You are free now. The past's behind you. Let it stay there." She nodded slowly, tears falling down her cheeks. He rested a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go home." As they walked back toward the cabin, the rising sun painted the land gold again. The windmill creaked and the ranch came back to life, as if the world itself was breathing again after holding still all night. Clara looked at Luke, at the man who had given her water, shelter, and now peace. She knew she could never repay him, but maybe she didn't have to. Maybe just being there, alive and beside him, was enough. For the first time in years, she felt safe. For the first time in years, she felt she belonged somewhere. And as they reached the porch, Luke glanced at her and said quietly, "You're home now, Clara. Whatever comes next. You're not alone anymore." She looked up at him, the light of morning in her eyes. "I believe that," she said softly. And together they stepped inside, leaving the desert wind behind them. The morning after the gunfight was quiet and strangely peaceful. The sun rose slowly over the hills, lighting the ranch in soft gold. The smell of dust and gunpowder still lingered in the air, but the danger was gone. The outlaws were buried far from the ranch, and the land had gone still again. Luke stood by the corral, his arm wrapped in a clean bandage, watching the sunrise. He had seen many mornings on this land, but this one felt different, lighter somehow, like the air itself had been washed clean. Inside the cabin, Clara was sweeping the floor. Every now and then, her eyes drifted toward the window, checking if Luke was still outside. When she saw him, something warm stirred in her chest. She didn't know how to name it, but it felt like safety, like hope. Two things she had almost forgotten existed. She stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to him. "You should rest," she said softly. He smiled a little. "I've been resting all my life. Feels good to stand." She shook her head, smiling back. "You say that now, but if you fall over, don't expect me to carry you." He laughed quietly. "I believe you." For a moment they stood in silence, watching the light spread across the valley. Clara sipped her coffee and breathed deeply. It felt strange to stand in the same place that had nearly turned into a battleground just hours ago. Yet now it seemed like the world had forgiven them. "Luke," she said after a while, her voice low, "I don't know how to thank you." He looked at her gently. "Don't need to, just live. That's enough." She turned her face toward the rising sun, her eyes glistening. "I almost gave up out there in the desert," she said. "I thought maybe I wasn't meant to make it, but now, I feel like I was meant to find this place." Luke nodded slowly. "The desert takes what it wants, but sometimes it gives something back." That day passed quietly. Clara cooked a small meal, helped Luke change his bandage, and mended the torn curtain near the window. Every sound of the house, every clatter of dishes, every creak of the floorboards felt alive again. The ranch, once silent and lonely, now felt like a home. In the afternoon, Luke went to check the horses. Clara followed him, brushing her hands on her skirt. "You really built all this by yourself?" she asked as they walked. "Mostly," he said. "Had a few hands in the early years, but after my brother passed, it was just me and Daisy here." She touched the worn fence post. "You must have worked hard," he smiled faintly. "Work keeps a man from thinking too much. Maybe that's why I never stopped." They walked to the barn. Clara looked around at the tools, the smell of hay, the light streaming through the wooden slats. "It's peaceful here," she said softly. "Even with everything that happened, it still feels safe." Luke nodded. "It's the kind of peace you build, not the kind that's given." She looked at him for a moment, thoughtful. "You lost your brother, didn't you? Out there in the desert?" He nodded once, his voice quiet. "We were driving cattle when a storm hit. Sand so thick you couldn't see your hand. He got turned around. I tried to find him, but—" He stopped and looked away toward the hills. "Never did." Clara lowered her head. "I'm sorry." He gave a faint smile. "It was a long time ago. But every time I help someone lost in this land, it feels like I'm helping him too." She didn't answer. Her throat tightened, but she understood him completely. The desert had taken from both of them, but somehow it had also brought them together. That evening, the wind turned gentle. They ate dinner by the fire, simple food but shared with warmth. Clara found herself laughing softly at his quiet jokes. And Luke couldn't remember the last time he'd seen laughter in his home. Afterward, he went out to the porch to smoke his pipe while Clara sat beside him, sewing a tear in his shirt. The stars came out one by one, bright and endless over the plains. "Do you ever think about leaving here?" she asked quietly. He looked out across the land. "Used to. Thought about selling the ranch once. But every time I packed my bags, the wind would start blowing, and I'd hear my brother's voice telling me to stay put. Guess I did," she smiled softly. "I think he'd be proud you did." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Maybe. Or maybe he'd just be glad the place finally has someone worth talking to." Clara laughed, shaking her head. "You don't talk much, Luke Turner. But when you do, it's always something that sticks." He grinned. "That's 'cause words are like bullets. You use them too often and they lose their aim." She looked at him with a gentle smile. "Well, your words hit just fine." The night stretched on quietly. The firelight flickered across their faces, and somewhere in the distance a lone coyote howled. But for the first time, neither of them felt afraid of the sound. In the days that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Clara started tending a small garden near the porch, planting herbs and a few wildflower seeds she had found near the stream. Luke repaired the barn roof, built a new water trough, and even painted the fence for the first time in years. The ranch began to look alive again, like it had been waiting all this time for someone to bring color back into it. One afternoon, as Luke worked near the barn, he heard Clara calling his name. He turned to see her running toward him, excitement in her voice. "Luke, come see." He followed her to the small patch of dirt behind the house. Tiny green shoots had begun to sprout from the ground. "They're growing," she said, her eyes bright with joy. "I didn't think they would, not in this dry soil." Luke crouched down beside her, studying the little plants. "Guess they found just enough to hold on to," he said. "Same as you." She smiled up at him, her face glowing in the sunlight. "Maybe that's what this place does. It teaches you to survive." He met her gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them was warm and calm, filled with quiet understanding. As the weeks passed, Clara learned how to ride a horse, fix a fence, and even handle a rifle without shaking. Luke watched her grow stronger, proud of how she faced everything with quiet courage. Sometimes in the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon in a sea of red and gold. One evening, as the light faded, Clara turned to him and said softly, "You gave me back my life, Luke." He shook his head. "You gave it back to yourself." "I just pointed the way." She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Still, I wouldn't have made it without you." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Maybe I wouldn't have either." For a time, they sat in silence, listening to the wind. There was no need for more words. Everything that mattered had already been said. Months later, the desert began to change. Rain finally came, gentle at first, then steady. The dry riverbeds filled again, and the earth, once cracked and broken, turned soft. Wildflowers bloomed across the hills, painting the land in color. Clara stood on the porch one morning, watching the rain fall across the fields, tears in her eyes. Luke came up beside her, resting his hat in his hands. "Been a long time since the desert looked this alive," he said. She turned to him, smiling through her tears. Maybe it just needed a reason to. He looked at her, and for a brief moment everything seemed to make sense. The drought, the loneliness, the years of silence. Maybe all of it had been leading to this. When the rain stopped, a rainbow stretched across the valley. Clara laughed softly. "It's beautiful." Luke nodded. "So are second chances." She looked at him, her heart full. "Then I guess we both found ours." The wind blew gently across the land, carrying the scent of wet earth and new life. The ranch stood tall again, stronger than before. The desert that had once tried to take everything from them had, in the end, given them more than they ever expected. And as the sun broke through the clouds, Luke Turner and Clara stood side by side on that porch, two survivors who had walked through the harshest storms and found peace at last. The land was still wild, the sky still endless, but now the ranch wasn't silent anymore. There was laughter inside its walls, the smell of food in the kitchen, and the sound of hope in every breath they took. Luke looked out at the horizon, then at Clara, and said quietly, "Guess the desert finally decided to give something back." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said softly. "It gave us each other." The wind whispered across the valley and the sun sank low, turning the land gold one last time before evening. For the first time in a long, long while, Luke Turner didn't feel alone, and Clara, who had once begged for a drop of water in a dying land, had finally found something far more precious, someone who made her feel alive again. The desert had tested them, but it had also healed them. And as night fell, the stars came out bright and clear, watching over the little ranch that had turned into a home.